Esther sought not to acquire anything beyond a subsistence of the plainest and most ascetic description for herself, and a simple abundance for her child. Her own dress was of the coarsest material and the most sombre hue, with only that one adornment, the scarlet letter, which it was her doom to wear. The child's attire, on the other hand, was distinguished by a fanciful, or we may rather say a fantastic ingenuity, which served indeed to heighten the airy charm that early began to develop itself in the little girl, but which appeared to have also a deeper meaning. We may speak further of it hereafter. Except for that small expenditure in the decoration of her infant, Esther bestowed all her superfluous means in charity on wretches less miserable than herself, who not infrequently insulted the hand that fed them. Much of the time, which she might readily have applied to the better efforts of her art, she employed in making coarse garments for the poor. It is probable that there was an idea of penance in this mode of occupation, and that she offered up a real sacrifice of enjoyment in devoting so many hours to such rude handiwork. She had in her nature a rich, voluptuous, oriental characteristic, a taste for the gorgeously beautiful, which, save in the exquisite productions of her needle, found nothing else in all the possibilities of her life to exercise itself upon. Women derive a pleasure incomprehensible to the other sex from the delicate toil of the needle. To Esther Prynne it might have made a mode of expressing and therefore soothing the passion of her life. Like all other joys, she rejected it as sin. This morbid meddling of conscience with the immaterial matter betokened, it is to be feared, no genuine and steadfast penitence, but something doubtful, something that might be deeply wrong beneath. In this matter, Esther Prynne came to have a part to perform in the world. With her native energy of character and rare capacity, it could not entirely cast her off, although it had set a mark upon her, more intolerable to a woman's heart than that which branded the brow of Cain. In all her intercourse with society, however, there was nothing that made her feel as if she belonged to it. Every gesture, every word, and even the silence of those with whom she came in contact implied and often expressed that she was banished and as much alone as if she had inhabited another sphere or communicated with common nature by other organs and senses than the rest of humankind. She stood apart from mortal interest, yet close beside them, like a ghost that revisits the familiar fireside, and can no longer make itself seen or felt, no more smile with the household joy, nor mourn with the kindred sorrow, or, should it succeed in manifesting its forbidden sympathy, awakening only terror and horrible repugnance. These emotions, in fact, and its bitterest scorn, besides, seemed to be the sole portion that she retained in the universal heart. It was not an age of delicacy, and her position, although she understood it well, and was in little danger of forgetting it, was often brought before her vivid self-perception. Like a new anguish by the rudest touch upon the tenderest spot, the poor, as we have already said, whom stretched forth to succour them, dames of elevated rank likewise, whose doors she entered in the way of her occupation, were accustomed to distill drops of bitterness into her heart, sometimes through the alchemy of quiet malice, by which women can concoct a subtile poison from ordinary trifles, and sometimes also by a coarser expression that felt upon the sufferer's defenseless breast like a rough blow upon ulcerated wound. Esther had schooled herself long and well, and she never responded to these attacks save by a flush of crimson that rose irrepressibly over her pale skin, and again subsided into the depths of her bosom. She was patient, a martyr indeed, but she forbore to pray for her enemies, lest, in spite of her forgiving aspirations, the words of the blessing should stubbornly twist themselves into a curse. Continually, and in 1,000 other ways, did she feel the innumerable throbs of anguish that had been so cunningly contrived for her by the undying and ever-active sentence of Puritan tribunal. Clergymen paused in the street to address words of exhortation that brought a crowd with its mingled grin and frown around the poor sinful woman. If she entered a church trusting to share the Sabbath smile of the universal Father, it was often her mishap to find herself the text of the discourse. She grew to have a dread of children, for they had imbibed from their parents a vague idea of something horrible in this dreary woman, gliding silently through the town, with never any companion but one only child. Therefore, first allowing her to pass, they pursued her at a distance with shrill cries and the utterance of a word that had no distinct purport to their own minds, but was none the less terrible to her, as proceeding from the lips that babbled and unconsciously, it seemed to argue so wide a diffusion of her shame that all nature knew of it. It could have caused her no deeper pang, and the leaves of the trees whispered the dark story among themselves, had the summer breeze murmured about it, had the wintry blast shrieked it aloud. Another peculiar torture was felt in the gaze of a new eye, when strangers looked curiously at the Scarlet Letter, and none ever failed to do so. They branded it afresh in Esther's soul, so that oftentimes she could scarcely refrain, yet always did refrain, from covering the symbol with her hand. But then again, an accustomed eye had likewise its own anguish to inflict. Its cool stare of familiarity was intolerable. From first to last, in short, Esther Prynne had always this dreadful agony in feeling a human eye upon the token. The spot never grew callous, it seemed on the contrary to grow more sensitive with daily torture. But sometimes, once in many days, or perchance in many months, she felt an eye, a human eye, upon the ignominious brand, that seemed to give a momentary relief, as if half of her agony were shared. The next instant, back it all rushed again, with still a deeper throb of pain, for in that brief interval she had sinned anew. Had Esther sinned alone? Her imagination was somewhat affected, and had she been the softer moral intellectual fibre, would have been still more so by the strange and solitary anguish of her life, walking to and fro with those lonely footsteps in the little world with which she was outwardly connected. It now and then appeared to Esther, if altogether fancy, it was nevertheless too potent to be resisted. She felt, or fancied then, that the Scarlet Letter had endowed her with a new sense. She shuddered to believe yet, could not help believing that it gave her a sympathetic knowledge of the hidden sin in other hearts. She was terror-stricken by the revelations that were thus made. What were they? Could they be other than the insidious whispers of the bad angel, who would fain have persuaded the struggling woman, as yet only half his victim, that outward guise of purity was but a lie, and that if truth were everywhere to be shown, a Scarlet Letter would blaze forth on many a bosom beside Esther Prynne? Or must she receive these intimations, so obscure yet so distinct, as truth? In all her miserable experience there was nothing else so awful and so loathsome as this sense. It perplexed as well as shocked her by the irreverent inopportuneness of the occasions that brought it into vivid action. Sometimes the red infamy upon her breast would give a sympathetic throb as she passed near a venerable minister or magistrate, the model of piety and justice, to whom the age of antique reverence looked up. As to a mortal man in fellowship of angels, what evil thing is at hand, would Esther say to herself, lifting her reluctant eyes. There would be nothing human within the scope of view, save the form of this earthly saint. Again, a mystic sisterhood would contumaciously assert itself as she met the sanctified frown of some matron, who, according to the rumor of all tongues, had kept cold snow within her bosom throughout life. The unsunned snow in the matron's bosom and the burning shame on Esther Prynne's, what had the two in common? Or, once more, the electric thrill would give her warning. Behold, Esther, here is a companion. And look up, she would detect the eyes of a young maiden glancing at the Scarlet Letter, shyly, and aside, and quickly averted with a faint chill crimson in her cheeks, as if her purity were somewhat sullied by the momentary glance. O fiend, whose talisman was that fatal symbol, wouldst thou leave nothing, whether in youth or age, for this poor sinner to revere? Such loss of faith is ever one of the saddest results of sin. Be it accepted as a proof that all was not corrupt in the poor victim of her own frailty, the man's hard law, that Esther Prynne yet struggled to believe that no fellow mortal was guilty like herself. The vulgar, who in these dreary old times were always contributing a grotesque horror to what interested their imaginations, had a story about the Scarlet Letter which we might readily work up into a terrified legend. They averred that the symbol was not mere scarlet cloth tinged in earthly dye-pot, but was red-hot with infernal fire, and could be seen glowing all alight whenever Esther Prynne walked abroad in the night-time. And we must needs say it seared Esther's bosom so deeply that perhaps there is more truth in rumor than our modern incredulity may be inclined to admit.